So, Jonathan Turley, I'm thrilled. Welcome to Chautauqua.
Thank you very much.
I'm just delighted you're here. And the most important question I have, because you're from Chicago, are you a Cubs or a White Sox guy?
Well, I'm a Cubs fan, and I was told to root for two teams, the Cubs and anyone playing the White Sox.
Was that natural from your mom and dad growing up in the area?
Oh, it was. You know, Northsiders and Southsiders, it's the longest subway trip you'll ever take when it comes to sports. And it was really sort of drilled into us. And we lived not far from Wrigley. In fact, Ernie Banks lived around the corner from us. Oh. And we used to play hooky, go and sit in the bleachers. You could get into the bleachers for about $2 after the first inning. And so there's a lot of, not only of us playing hooky, but also fathers who would show up playing hooky from work. And they'd take their shirts off and then take their T-shirts and wrap them around their heads so they didn't get sunburned. And so it was all these turbaned older guys drinking Schlitz beer and these kids playing hooky from school. That was about it.
Were you a bleacher bum?
You bet.
Yeah, that's amazing when you go out there and people stand in line to get into that specific area, because that is the hot ticket.
It is the hot ticket, and you know it's funny because years later I developed a relationship with Justice Stevens, who was not just a Chicagoan but a Cubs fan. And until his last day on the court, he could recite all the statistics of the Chicago Cubs. And in fact, I finagled a last call with him because he was really, it was hard to get him on if you were wanting to write a column. And I just told the secretary that I had heard that Babe Ruth didn't call the last shot and that Justice Stevens never saw anything like that. And within about 10 minutes, I got a call from Stevens saying, "What's this about his not calling that last shot? I was there, I saw it." So,
no kidding, that's
yeah.
Fantastic. You know, speaking of baseball and the Supreme Court, you know, the antitrust exemption, the Toolson case, probably one of the more recent ones, but they still have a baseball exemption.
Yeah.
Which is the aberration of the Supreme Court, because football doesn't, anybody else in professional sports doesn't.
That's right.
I interviewed one of the clerks for Justice Blackmun, who wrote that opinion about baseball, and listing all of those who are named, you know, it should have been in the Hall of Fame or not in the Hall of Fame. Did you have a chance to ever talk to Blackmun at all?
I never talked to him about that opinion. I did talk to him. It was funny, of course, because he was called one of the Minnesota Twins with Justice Berger, which became more of a reference for irony because Blackmun then went further and further to the left, and so they were hardly twins by the end.
Yeah. Were you destined to be a lawyer?
Well, no. When I graduated from Chicago, I decided to go and write the great American novel. I ended up writing a couple of not-so-great American plays, and that was enough to send me to law school. Mm-hmm. So I took a year off and then went to law school, but I was always interested in law school. My mother was the president of Jane Addams Hall House in Chicago, and she was a social worker, and I would often accompany her into slum housing and to confront gangs, and I was always impressed that she would occasionally bring these young lawyers with her who would bring lawsuits to shut down some of these homes. And so it left a mark on me, and she had created one of the first abused women's shelters there in Chicago, so it was quite an influence.
Did you ever think of practicing law?
Oh, I did practice law. In fact, I still do. I've been a criminal defense attorney for most of my career. I've done national security cases, espionage cases, largely, a lot of criminal defense work. I've done constitutional litigation. So I represented the House of Representatives in the successful challenge of the Obamacare funding. And I've represented cabinet members, judges, done some military justice cases.
When you do your bio, and I read it in your Wikipedia bio, which of course is the source of all knowledge, it's long and it's incredible because you are kind of the puppet, the poet, the pirate, the poet. I mean, you're just commentator, you're professor at a prestigious law firm, you're a litigator, you argue in a appellate arguments. Are you able to keep this all straight?
Well, it's funny because, being a law professor allows you a great deal of flexibility. And so I'm able to take the cases that I want to take, but I'm also able to write. Being a commentator and television analyst is a different skill set. You're taught to teach in 50-minute increments. Trying to say what you need to say on a complex legal story in 30 or 40 seconds can be a real challenge. And that was sort of made clear to me once when I started at CBS, and the president of CBS asked me how I thought my extended interview with Dan Rather had gone. And I said something about not being able to talk about Hamilton, and the president of CBS looked at me like I had three heads and said, I'll clean this up, by the way, and said, that signal's on its way to Mars, and walked away. And I realized this is not academia. You've got to say what you have to say, and you move on.
We talked a little bit last night, and I appreciated all the comment, but you've been affiliated with ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox News, I mean, you name it. Always curious how much advance notice you have when they put you, all of a sudden, you're live.
Usually you'll know you're going to go on that day. I've got 2 interviews scheduled while I'm here, so you know the subject. But I would say at least 30% to 40% you have no warning because it's breaking news. And that's the thing about the new media. Everything is faster, both in terms of print and in television. We all travel with cameras and mics. So it's 24/7. And so the expectation is that you can be on the air within literally minutes. And that's what the media today demands. It is a lot faster. And as being a columnist, I used to write pieces, and I would spend a couple weeks with the New York Times editing it. These days, I'll often write a column in 25 minutes, and it'll be up and running on the site within 40 minutes.
Because of that speed, more likely to not have reread it, edited it. Do you have a chance to go in and to kind of update it and note it on the bottom of the I mean, do people say, hey, you missed that point?
Yeah, look, you miss a lot when you write fast, and that's part of the price of the ticket. This is not something that you can hope to be a perfectionist on. But you try, particularly as an academic, to get things right. And I have put in corrections when I have reposted it. I've gotten my newspapers. It's usually not a big deal. It's usually something that I forgot to mention. Sometimes I'll get a date wrong. So you correct those. But it is part of the perils of the task. I think that for commentators and analysts who are academics, we may feel a little more of a burden than others to get it right. I certainly do. I think this is a great privilege that I have, not just to be a law professor, and I do think teaching is a great privilege, but also to be a commentator, an analyst. It's a privilege to speak to the country, to try to explain what's happening. And I view that as a real moral burden to get it right. I try not to let my own views, sneak into the analysis. Sometimes I'm asked my opinion, I give it, but I try very hard to get it right. I always used to joke that in my next life I'm going to come back as a political analyst because you don't have to be right. In fact, no one expects you to be right. Fortunately, with a legal analyst, you're still expected to be right. And that means that you don't necessarily agree with what the Supreme Court's doing or what a court may rule, but you owe it to the viewers to explain where you think this is going to end up.
We just concluded the term of the Supreme Court, and you, among others, I mean, it's breaking news. you don't even have a chance. Literally, run out the door, the runner runs to somebody with a mic, and within 30 seconds you're live because you got the hot ticket. You have the opinion, which you have not read in advance, and you got to figure out what the answer is.
All right.
And talk a little bit about it, and if you could, it's a double question here, the process generally, but you talked last night, if you can, about Bob Schieffer, that story, which is insightful.
Well, that is the most perilous moment for a legal analyst, and you have to make the call, and your network always wants to be first. And I spoke to at a conference with a lot of young, I know some more seasoned people in the media, but one of them asked, "What in 30 years, what have you learned from the 4 networks you've worked for?" And I said, the most important lesson is never trust a network. So when the network says, you make the call and we'll watch your back, don't believe that. You make the wrong call and you're gone. You're wrong, you're gone. But you have to make the call. That's what you're paid for. So you got to try to get it right. And sometimes that is really death-defying. I mean, when it came to Bush v. Gore, which is the one you're referring to, every network wanted to be the first to call it. Dan Rather wanted to be the first at CBS. So that was the first time that
You were at CBS at that time.
I was working for CBS at that time.
Yep.
And I was in the fishbowl in New York, as it's called, which is where the anchor's desk was. And and that was the only time I've ever had 2 IFBs. So an IFB is this thing in your ear where the producer can speak to you. And you get used to it. It can be a little bit disorienting for some people. On this occasion, they had 2 IFBs. And so I had to be on live talking with Rather as we led up to announcing who won. And then I had to say who won. So the way they did this is I was talking to Rather. In one ear, I had the producer talking to me. In the other ear, I had someone reading the opinion from front to end. And what I was told is that when I got to the point that I felt like I could make the call, I would touch my ear, and then Rather would pop the question. So we were just talking live when I got to a point, and I touched my ear and declared that Bush had won. One of the other networks at the same time declared that Gore had won. And in fact, the producer in my ear went wild and said, "This network just said Gore, are you sure?" And I'm still on live doing the interview, and I'm thinking, for the love of Mike, am I sure? No, you've been reading this in my ear, but I'm pretty confident that that's the case. But that was a particularly emblematic type of situation, because the reason the other legal analysts got it wrong was understandable. Roberts had written the opinion, and the word was that he had switched at the last minute and decided that he did not want to strike down the independent mandate for Obamacare. And so he basically inserted a section. So if you read the first section on federalism, it was a roaring analysis of why it was unconstitutional under federalism. But you had to read to the next section where he said, unless it's called a tax, which, by the way, no one called it. None of the parties argued it was a tax. But he said, unless you call it a tax, and it's a tax. And so it was a real almost bait and switch for legal analysts. And so you had to read past the first section.
And the results, the other guy who made the call, is that back to your point, networks don't have your back.
Well, no, you're paid to get it right. And so it's like no one's going to keep a quarterback that overthrows, every one of the receivers. And so networks are understanding, but at moments like that, you got to get it right. And look, we all do. Make assumptions, can make mistakes. So it's not a sudden death thing. But on the big ticket items, yeah, the pressure's on.
How did you get into that type of business? You're a law professor. Did somebody give you a call and say, Professor Turley, would you like to go on TV?
It's funny. I started as a columnist. So I was writing regularly for Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, New York Times. Eventually started writing regularly for LA Times, then went to USA Today. And so even when I was a judicial clerk, I was working as a columnist. And that sort of led to some of these networks saying, can you go on air for us? And that fairly quickly led to my first contract. I worked with ABC, CNN a great deal on what's called Spot. And then my first full-time contract was with NBC. And then I went from NBC to CBS, and then went back to NBC, then went back to CBS, then did CBS, BBC together, and now I'm at Fox. And so it's been quite a journey. I've liked all of the networks, but it's fun to actually experience each of those cultures.
And mostly you're asked to analyze and comment on law. Do you ever find that because it's politics, well, sometimes the law can be real politics,
right?
That you have to find, do you draw a red line, or do you?
No, because there isn't a red line often. Particularly in Washington, D.C., law and politics merge, and you can't really consider one without the other. What you try to do is to help the viewer understand what is a legal judgment and what's a political judgment. And in some cases, that means explaining why people who might be very upset with the Supreme Court, that it doesn't mean that these justices disagree with the political policy. An example of that is the birthright citizenship case. If you were to get the justices to vote on birthright citizenship as a referendum, I expect that you would have a majority, if not a strong majority, against birthright citizenship. But they were looking at this solely as a constitutional matter, and they could not get there. Now, it was close. It was a one-vote margin. But there were good arguments on both sides. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time after birthright citizenship came out is to remind people that this was a close question. That if you look at the drafters, some of them clearly did not believe that the 14th Amendment covered birthright citizenship. But some did. There was a division among drafters even back then. And there was a division on the Supreme Court. And so it's a very messy record. I read with great interest because you've been covering impeachments. Impeachments is a subject that I, being at a certain age, remember the Nixon, and then there's a pauses, and all of a sudden you got Trump, and what was an impeachment, etc. And you've become sort of an expert in that area of. Yeah, I testified at the Clinton impeachment and at the Trump impeachment and at the Biden impeachment hearing, which was held as to whether they would proceed with impeachment. And they're all very different. When I testified in the Clinton impeachment, I testified as someone who voted for Clinton. In fact, some of the Clinton administration had reached out to me about becoming a federal judge, which I declined to do. But that was a larger hearing. It had more of us involved. I thought it was a more substantive hearing. And then the Trump impeachment, I was the only Republican witness. So the Democrats controlled the House. So they limited the Republicans to one witness. And they brought in 3 witnesses. So that was a very different dynamic. And then finally, the Biden impeachment is much like the Trump one. What was interesting about Trump is that in that first impeachment, I criticized Congress that this was not how you do impeachment. They did no investigation. They had no real substantive hearings. I said, this is going to be your only hearing before impeachment. And that's simply wrong. That's not really carrying out your constitutional duty. It's certainly not carrying out the common law of impeachment. Well, in the second impeachment, they outdid themselves, and they did what I called a snap impeachment. They just didn't have any hearing at all. So there was a lot of damage done to impeachments. What has been sacrificed is its deliberative aspects. There's no more important act for the Congress than the removal of a United States president. It should be done in a sober and mature and detached way. It doesn't mean you won't have partisans, but people can change their minds, even partisans. That's what happened in the Johnson impeachment. where he was saved by members of the opposing party. And over time, despite the hatred for Johnson, and he was deeply hated, they realized that what they were doing was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them described how when he voted in the Senate, he said, "I looked down into my open grave and jumped," which is true in the political sense. They were all, he was certainly defeated, as were his colleagues, voters that never forgave him for protecting Johnson.
Segueing a little bit, because you do cover the law and the rule of law. I'm the co-founder of the Robert H. Jackson Center, so I have more than a casual interest in subjects of that, and noted with great interest your law review article on transformative justice and the ethos of Nuremberg, and going so far as to allowing us how that the Nuremberg trial was perhaps one of the greatest trials in at least the past century or so. Why did you choose the subject? What generated or caused you to kind of take on it?
A couple of things. One was that I was looking at trials at that point academically. I also had a colleague, Tom Bergenthal, who I loved a great deal, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. In fact, he was the last child to leave Auschwitz. And his story is also discussed in that law review article. But in looking, I was trying to understand the role of trials in society. Trials have a social dialogic role that they resonate with the American people, whether it's the Limburg trial or the Simpson trial or something like Nuremberg. They have this dialogic and transformative role. They change people's views. Limburg was enormously important, as was the Scopes trial. People began to understand more about the legal system. So the same is true with Simpson. Many people learned a great deal from the Simpson trial as to how the law works. And I wanted to understand a little further of why trials hold this transformative role. And it also goes into the role of the jury and how jurors change. One of the things I mentioned is that originally, when we were struggling to figure out the core question of guilt, we started in the most primitive way, trying to get God to tell us who was guilty and who was not. And that led to trials by ordeal, which eventually were eliminated. But the great advance in civil liberties in eliminating trial by ordeal was torture. So the idea was that since God's not going to tell us, there's only one person that can really tell us, and that's you. And so they would torture you, believing that an innocent man, even tortured, would never accuse himself or confess something he didn't do. But one of the things I noted is that even among the trials by ordeal, and then later in the torture cases, jurors played a very important role. There was one ordeal called the ordeal of the poisoned bread. And so the entire village would gather around, and you'd be given this poisoned bread. And a man would stand there and hold the antidote. And then everyone in the village would clap 500 times. And if you were still standing by 500 claps, they'd give you the antidote. And in some ways, it may have been the first jury system, because you can imagine if the jury thought you were innocent, those claps would come a lot faster than if they thought you were guilty. It really was to convey, both the trials by ordeal, later torture, that guilt was beyond question, because back then you had to accept it. And many times judges would ride circuit. You wouldn't see a judge for a year, maybe even 2 years. So when that judge left that village, that village had to believe that justice was done. Otherwise, you'd have more killings. In many ways, we try to achieve the same thing today, even though we use scientific proof. Nuremberg was perhaps the most important in that sense, and we were very fortunate to have Jackson as one of the prosecutors. They understood, particularly Jackson understood, that he was not just trying to prove the guilt of the defendants. He was putting on trial the genocide of the Nazis. He knew that there would be deniers. He knew that There were people that still would not accept the result. And he knew that this trial was going to be watched, particularly by Germans. And it did have a transformative effect, including on Germans. Jackson was an interesting character in that way. You know, one of the complaints against how we select our justices is that we often have justices with very little legal experience. And that can come out. You know, it can come out during oral arguments. Some of the justices will say things and we'll look at each other like, oh, for the love of Mike, you've never been in a courtroom. If you had, you would never said what you just said. But they come with different skills, but many of them have not practiced. Jackson walked the walk. He was a highly educated person that actually had one of the broadest resumes. He had practice, he had government service, of course. All of that gave him a certain depth to his service on the court. He was also in many ways, it made him particularly practical. Mm-hmm. That is, his famous quote about the Constitution not being a suicide pact is a quote that I've actually criticized because it's often used by people to limit civil liberties. But that's not what Jackson intended, and it's sort of like Oliver Wendell Holmes with yelling fire in a crowded theater. Holmes himself walked away from that because people were misusing it. They were using it as a way to say that therefore we can just limit speech anytime we darn well need to or want to. Jackson didn't intend his line to be this invitation for compromise on every issue. But he was very practical. And it's interesting because Jackson, of course, had Rehnquist as his clerk. Then Rehnquist had Roberts as his clerk. And so there's this wonderful legacy of chiefs. But in some ways, Roberts comes closest to Jackson, because Roberts has that same very practical streak. He wants to find ways where the court's credibility will not be lost. He doesn't like the court getting ahead of its skis. He likes to have states and the political system make decisions, not the courts. Those were all very Jacksonian things. Jackson didn't like the court playing that role either.
Part of what's in the forefront today is the Youngstown steel seizure case and the presidential powers, implied presidential powers, the use of the executive orders. Do you see, I know you've written about his three-part formula. Is that relevant today?
It is, I think, Jackson's most lasting legacy. There are very few doctrines that have been reinforced to the extent as Youngstown. And indeed, in many ways, Jackson has been mimicked in other opinions. His tripartite test is still used, is still respected. And it was interesting that when the court dealt with presidential immunity, it was a very Jacksonian opinion. They broke up presidential immunity cases into three, and they were very Jacksonian in terms of when something is a core presidential function, when it's a personal function. It was sort of Youngstown on immunity. And in some ways, Jackson may have influenced the court not just in doctrine, but in methodology, in that sense. But it was also quintessentially Jackson, because he looked at this very difficult issue of presidential seizure of steel mills and presidential power, and he cut through it to look for that middle point that, the Constitution to him was a balancing of values. There were no absolute rights. And it was a document written by very practical people. In my book, I talk about how the framers, particularly Madison, wanted to create a system that could withstand the pressures of a democratic process. So Rage in the Republic compares the American Revolution to the French Revolution. And Madison famously said that if every Athenian was a Socrates, every assembly would still be a mob. And what he was saying is that Athens was destined to fail, as it did. Athens, the democracy didn't last very long. It became a tyranny. And the reason is that the system itself couldn't handle the pressures that it generated. And Madison and the rest knew that. You know, Benjamin Rush said, we can't have democracy if it becomes a mobocracy. And so these individuals created a very practical document that would force compromise, would divide powers. And Madison and also Montesquieu and other key writers said, if you want to create a system, you first understand human beings. Madison really understood human beings. And in the Rage of the Republic, I compare Madison to Paine. And it's a very interesting comparison. I spent a lot of time talking about Paine. He's a fascinating character. Even though I'm a Madisonian scholar, he's an inexhaustibly interesting historical character.
Thomas Paine.
Yes, the funny thing is that Thomas Paine, I think, fashioned himself, and in some ways this was legitimate, as being closer to the people than Madison and others. And that was certainly true. But in a curious way, Madison understood people better than Paine. Paine did not want those auxiliary precautions, those divisions of power. He wanted more direct democracy. He wanted a unicameral legislative system. Madison was against that. But the reason I spend a lot of time on Thomas Paine in Rage of the Republic is he was one of two figures that played a role in both the American and French revolutions. And when he went to France, he saw what happens if you have more direct democracy, if you don't have those Madisonian protections. And it damn near came to close to killing him. Mm-hmm. He was within hours of being guillotined at one point. And to Thomas Paine's credit, he came to acknowledge that Madison was right in many respects. Jackson really understood that. Understood that this sort of practical balance that comes out of the U.S. Constitution. And in that sense, I think people are often wrong about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. You know, scholars often dismiss the Declaration of Independence. I don't. Rage of the Republic is largely about the Declaration of Independence. What the Constitution was Madison's system to guarantee what was promised in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was an Enlightenment document. We were the first major Enlightenment revolution, but it was Lockean from top to bottom. It was this product of the Enlightenment. The Constitution was Madison's way of achieving that, but he understood to achieve it, you had to understand the flaws of human beings. You had to understand factions and the divisions of human beings. He understood that better than Thomas Paine. Jackson also understood that. You know, he viewed our system as this powerful engine of democratic choice that is funneled into this framing that Madison created, that pushes for compromise. This was a document that talks about sweeping human rights, but nothing is treated as an absolute. And that really is probably, if you look at Jacksonian philosophy, that's what comes out of it. In many ways, Youngstown reflects that.
So this is the ultimate. So when you type in Jonathan Turley and Robert H. Jackson, you know, your good friend AI Mode says, more broadly, Turley often invokes historical precedents like Nuremberg to caution against, quote, governmental rage, end of quote, and the criminalization of political speech, arguing that the law must remain a neutral arbiter even during times of intense social conflict. Did AI get it right?
Strangely, it did get it right. I guess a blind squirrel will find a nut at some point, but no, that does get it right. And Nuremberg really does represent the best of us, and so did Jackson represent the best of us. Nuremberg was a moment where a trial focused a world on a horizon that we were still trying to reach. That's what Jackson was trying to do. You know, trials often talk about standards that few of us really satisfy. You know, when we talk about a reasonable person, most of us are not reasonable. Most of us do things that are unlawful or unreasonable or uncivil. In many ways, the law focuses us on a horizon that we want to reach as a society. Nuremberg was like that. Nuremberg was talking about who we can be by showing who we have been. And Jackson put in front of the world this horrendous view of the brutality of humanity. And you know, one of the things I talk about in Rage in the Republic is that there was an influential writer in the French Revolution who remarked that revolution is like Saturn, it devours its children. Certainly Thomas Paine saw that in France. But I talk in the book about this Saturn's gene that we know we all have. It's the ability of human beings to become monsters. What Jackson was describing in Nuremberg was how humanity became the victim of monsters. And this gets to the whole expression of the banality of evil when you look at people like Eichmann and others, that these monsters were not some, you know, movie villain. They were these often very weak people like Eichmann who unleashed the worst parts of humanity on itself. Jackson was able to capture that in Nuremberg, and he didn't spare anyone. You know, if you look at how Nuremberg was done, Jackson just stripped it away. He wanted people to see the films, not talk about them, see the piles of corpses for what really happened.
You talk in your article about, and you mentioned previously Tom Bergenthal, Judge Bergenthal. I had the privilege of meeting him and doing a brief interview with him in Cleveland. But talk a little bit about him, because he was and is extraordinary.
You know, when I joined the George Washington faculty, one of the big reasons was because Tom Bergenthal was on the faculty. I had long admired him, even when I was a law student. You know, he had gone to Auschwitz with his family and was separated by Dr. Mengele for experiments. Mengele would often pick children, and Mengele amputated a couple of Tom's toes. In a very strange series of events, Mengele repeatedly saved Tom. At night, all the children would sleep on this concrete floor, and they would have these cards attached to their ankles. And unless there was a signature by Mengele, everyone would be then taken to be to the gas chambers. Every night, every morning I should say, Tom would wake up and find most of the children gone. And he would find that Mengele had put this notation on his card. And he made it to the end. In fact, he was the last child to be released. And that proved to be a great burden, because he ended up in a Jewish orphanage. And at that point, the Jewish underground was taking children to Palestine, which was illegal. And Tom wanted to go. He had no family. And they kept on telling him, you can't go, because all these reporters are coming to talk to you, because you're the last person to leave Auschwitz. So if you disappear, they'll know we're taking the Jewish children to Palestine. So after all the other children had left, they took Tom, and they took him to a train station. And Tom told me this story about how this functionary at the train station, this German official, said, Bergenthal, do you have someone looking for you? And he said, no, all my family was killed at Auschwitz. And he said, really? Because there was a woman here, and she was looking for a boy your age. And he goes, no, my mother, everyone is dead. And he said, you know, I'm going to hold you. There'll be a train tomorrow. Let me just see if I can find that woman. Well, he did, and he couldn't find her. And it turned out it was Tom's mother. She had survived. Now, this woman had been walking from town to town looking for her son, going to train stations. And she had just been there the day before Tom arrived. And she later said that she had never gone back to a train station. She would go to the next city. And she stopped on the outskirts, and she said something stopped her. And she turned around and she walked back and went onto the platform just as Tom was waiting for the train. And she was reunited with her son. And she and Tom went to England. He studied with such greats as Louis Sohn. The two of them, Louis and Tom, helped coin the term human rights law. And he became a member of the World Court. And one of the cases that came up were Holocaust deniers. And Tom, in that case, gave the most devastating recusal order in history. He said, he wrote to the court and said, I hereby recuse myself. This is a case in which the litigants are claiming that the Holocaust did not occur. And as a survivor of the genocide at Auschwitz, I have a conflict of interest. Well, that was the fastest case dismissal you've ever seen in your life. But the thing about Thomas Bergenthal that I loved is that he was not just the most decent human being, but he had become incredibly tolerant of everyone. And he fought for the rights of everyone, including people that hated him. And I remember one time Tom had an emergency. He had to have a bypass surgery. And he ended up at GW Hospital. And he was brought in on the gurney. And then his arm fell off the gurney in the surgical theater. And these doctors saw his Auschwitz tattoo. And two of the doctors started to cry because they suddenly realized that they had one of the survivors of the Holocaust and how overwhelming it was that his life was in their hands. Tom had that impact on people. He had it on me. He made you want to be a better person because he had seen the worst of humanity. And unlike some where that destroys them, for Tom, it made him believe more in humanity.
You conclude this whole article by saying, for me, Tom Bergenthal is the face of Nuremberg. And in the footnote, it said he became a judge of the International Court of Justice, which is kind of where I connect in, because when we were doing a tour, I was inquiring about the audio tapes, audio coverage of the Nuremberg trial. Interestingly enough, the International Court of Justice was the repository of the only set.
Is that right?
One set of the complete discs, like phonograph records we think of, and they had to figure out whether and how they could preserve it, because if they put a needle on it, they knew it would destroy it. And so they did. And he led that charge. And now today, through the Library of Congress and Jackson Center, among other things, I have spent 2.5 years, 3 years, grabbing the audio, the entire audio of the entire trial, editing it, and getting all the sound stuff out of it. But we would not have it but for Tom Bergenthal. That's just a little legacy that maybe most people would not be aware, but he felt it was important to somehow, some way, to fund, find funding to have this laser technology. It's a fascinating story. I mean, if you really want to dig deep, how do we have the records today, the audio of it all? I mean, you're in the communication business, you'd say, when I hear something of Jackson or something that represents Nuremberg, how did we get that? How did we get that? Well, it's the preservation, because only one set survived, and it was there. And only 25 hours, I'm digressing, but only 25 hours of film, because you see film of it, but only 25 hours of the entire. They just did snippets. Anyways, I digress. That's a Tom Bergenthal story. how do you wrap your head around Jonathan Turley and all that you've done, including most importantly the Rage in the Republic? Here now on the 250th, I'm sure the timing is not just coincidental, but how does one wrap their head around? How does one describe a Jonathan Turley?
I'm not too sure I would venture to do that. You want your body of work to speak for itself, and you're never going to satisfy everyone, either as an academic or as a columnist or as a commentator. But you want it to stand the test of time. I must tell you, as I said earlier, I feel incredibly privileged to have had the life that I've had, to be able to teach young people, to be able to speak to the country on legal issues. I take that very seriously because it's an opportunity to have a conversation with other Americans, and that's what Rage in the Republic was really about. I spent about 6 years on this book, and I wanted to tell our story, to understand what it was that brought us to this point. These are revolutionary times, but we remain a revolutionary people. In the book, I quote a Frenchman who wrote a very popular book in France after our revolution. And in his book, and this is a line I quote a great deal in Rage in the Republic, he says, "What then is this American?" And what he was referencing was the fascination that many people around the world had with this revolution. They couldn't understand how a people that had nothing in common with each other, little connection to the earth, the land, little connection to calcified institutions or class structure, would come together at this one point on the globe and create the world's first major Enlightenment revolution. The Enlightenment writers had been around for over 100 years. And so this writer asked, what then is this American? People wanted to know. They viewed us as almost like a new species. And one of the things that I ask in Rage in the Republic is, can we answer that question today? Who were we then, and who are we now? It's a question that we have to be able to answer if we want another 250 years. But we are experiencing not a constitutional crisis, but a crisis of faith. People are forgetting who we are, what we have in common. What we offer the world is still new. What the Declaration of Independence said had never been said as the foundation of a country, not the way we did it. To say that rights come to us not from the government but from our Creator, that there are certain rights that make us fully human, that without them we cannot be human the way that we were intended. Those were revolutionary ideas then, they're revolutionary ideas now. Many of the voices, as I point out in Rage in the Republic, that we hear today are the same voices that we heard back then. The same people saying, no, that can't be true. No, free speech can't be that robust or broad. We need to decide what then is that American. Who are we? Because Benjamin Franklin was right. It's our republic to keep. That's the reason that the subtitle of this book is The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution. It may never be finished in that sense. And that's what I think Franklin was capturing. Every generation has to answer that question and keep this republic.
We have the Declaration of Independence, we have the Constitution, we have to implement that in the way which often the courts decide. That's the rule of law. You're in that business, the law professor business, but you're also an advocate. And on occasion you've had opportunities to argue before the Court of Appeals. Have you been argued before the Supreme Court?
Not in front of the Supreme Court. I've had cases in front of the Supreme Court, but not argued.
But arguing is a different animal. And you famously go up there with virtually no notes.
Right.
And first of all, could you explain the procedure? And at one point, there had to be the first time you look up and say, "May it please the court."
Well, you know, all of us remember the first time we were in court. I remember my first case, it was a criminal case, and I walked in and realized I didn't even know which side of the courtroom to sit on. And this old prosecutor looked at me and said, "Kid, is this your first trial, or first case?" It was a hearing, not a trial. And I said, "It's that obvious?" And he said, "You're sitting over there." And he was a very nice man. And I've tried very hard to spot other lawyers that might be a little bit green. I tend not to bring things up on appellate argument. And the funny thing is, for my law students, when I teach them in the first year, I have a rule that they have to close their books and can't look at their notes when I call on them to talk about a case. And the reason is that I'm always struck in litigation how many of my opponents read from notes. Jurors hate it, judges hate it. But even I was in one very well-known case and they had the top litigator at DOJ, and we were in front of the DC Circuit, and he sat there, and he stood there at the podium just reading, never looking up. And it's because he didn't, he couldn't see that he was losing those judges. He couldn't see their physical movements, their faces, or their attempt to ask him a question. And I tell my students, you know, I think that he got that habit here and now. He got it in his first year of law school, when people like me asked you to brief cases and then you read them, and it became a crutch, and you can't lose it. So we're not going to develop that crutch. We're going to be like Cortez. We're going to burn our ships at the water's edge, and you're just going to look at me, and you're going to tell me about this case. And at first my students are like, "Oh, for the love of Mike, do we really need to do this?" But eventually they get to like it. And so that's the reason I don't take much up, because I think that you have very limited time. And I've never had an oral argument where no, that's not true. I've only had one oral argument where I had too much time, and that was I was representing the head of the Supreme Team in New York, which was the largest drug cartel at that time in New York. And I represented a guy named Fingers Miller. And he was the head of this crew, and they had a pretty blood-soaked legacy. And I had a problem getting to New York, and I arrived just before the argument in the Second Circuit, and there were about 20 members of this gang. And so I go into the attorney's room, and there's all these 20 eat what you kill criminal defense attorneys, salt of the earth, the type of attorneys I love. You know, they're just these tough, you know, attorneys that go from courtroom to courtroom. And so they all said, "Professor, it's good to see you. We got to go straight in." And so I go in, and the first guy stands up and he says, "My name is such and such, and I represent the defendant Pinella, and I hereby yield all my time to Professor Turley." And I'm looking at him, and then the next guy stands up and says, "I too yield all my time to Professor." One after another, they yielded all their time, to the point that the panel was laughing because I was clearly the last person to be informed of this. I had prepared for a 15-minute argument, and the chief judge says, "Professor, I get the feeling that you're as surprised as we are, but you have about an hour now of argument. How do you want to divide that?" And it was the first time I had too much time. I was like, "Oh, for the love of God, how am I going to fill an hour?" But it's sort of like finding a parking place in Manhattan. You can't drive by it. You got to use it, you know. And so I used as much of that time as possible. But for most of the time when you do appellate argument, you prepare, and if you're focused on the script and you read it, you often don't see that the judges aren't buying something, and you're not as nimble as you should be. And so I'll bring up basically one piece of paper, and that's enough to give me, just to remind me, I want to get a couple of these cases in, make sure I talk about them.
We're off the subject perhaps a little bit, but you're also in the business of being a professor at George Washington, and the use of AI. I have seen, I'm sure you've seen videos, YouTubes of appellate or attorneys arguing before judges, and they just ream them because the citations are wrong, and one after another after another, and of course the lawyer dies 1,000 deaths. How do you teach that? I mean, how do you? It's a whole new world now.
We're all struggling with it. Some schools have banned computers and laptops. The University of Chicago just did that about a week ago. Other professors are abandoning home tests and papers for in-class tests. I may have to do that. I've seriously considered that in my Supreme Court class. I used to have them go home and write opinions in my Supreme Court class. Now that's sort of tough because you suspect that some of them are having AI write these briefs. So we're having to make changes. It's a very dangerous habit for students. AI often gets things wrong. In Raging of the Republic, I talk about AI and robotics and how that's going to affect our democratic system. But I mentioned that I was defamed by ChatGPT, that years ago, in fact, only till recently, if you had put into ChatGPT, who's Jonathan Turley, it would say, I have no idea, and they would not give you any more information. And the reason is that years ago, when someone contacted me and said, when I put in your name, it says that you were guilty of sexually harassing and assaulting law students while teaching at Georgetown on a field trip to Alaska. Now, the fascinating thing about that is every aspect of that statement was demonstrably false. I've never been at Georgetown. I've never been accused of sexual harassment, let alone sexual assault. We don't take field trips with law students. And I've never taken a student to Alaska. So literally every single thing of that was made up. And so the New York Times, the Post wrote about this. What's interesting is that the Post contacted me, and I think they were a bit disappointed it wasn't true. But they said, this isn't true. And I said, well, I know that. And they said, well, here's the thing. We don't understand how it came up with yours. Because we're looking at hallucinations by AI. But yours is different because the entirety of it's hallucinated. We can't find anything that triggered the hallucination. That's what intrigues us, is that it seemed to be pure imagination. It's not like they were looking at a piece that you were in Alaska and there's a student mentioned. We can't find even that. And so ChatGPT's response to all this coverage was to ghost me. So they basically wiped out my existence. So instead of defaming me, I didn't exist. And in the book, I talk about this, that I never sued them. I've never sued people for defamation, but maybe I should have with ChatGPT. But I talk about it in the book because this is a huge amount of power that a company can have, where it can. I wasn't the only one that they effectively disappeared because they had defamed. So as ChatGPT would hallucinate about some of us, they would then wipe away our existence. And the question I ask in the book is how robotics and AI are going to impact us, particularly because now we have autonomous AI programs that are engaging in political speech. But also, the combination of AI and robotics is going to result in a massive loss of jobs. And I happen to be a believer in the free market, and I believe that it's going to create new jobs, but not right away. And many of the people who lose their jobs are not likely to get new jobs. I mean, that's part of what we have to deal with. That is, we're going to have a large unemployed population that may become unemployable. So how does that affect democracy? How does that affect our system? And one of the things I say in Raging of the Republic is that our system doesn't work if we're a kept population. If the government simply subsidizes millions of people where they rely entirely on the government, our system won't function the way it's supposed to. That's not the citizen it's designed for. So we have to preserve what I call a liberty-enhancing economy, an economy that allows people to be financially independent from the government.
Wow, I have to tell you, really absorbed a lot of your time, and I really appreciate it. Have you got a sense of Chautauqua here now that you've been?
Well, I love it, and I've gone to a lot of the music, and I just heard the Chautauqua Symphony last night, which was just magical. It's such a great community. My only wish is that they return to greater diversity of viewpoints. That's what's missing, and it's such a beautiful summer program. I wish it would capture more of the country and to allow for a more a broader array, at least, of different viewpoints.
Sure.
But it is a gorgeous place filled with incredibly nice people, and I've just enjoyed it immensely.
Well, I'm sure everybody's going to enjoy you tomorrow. It should be Monday. I assume your topic deals with the rage in the Republic?
It does indeed.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it.